Krishna Parabrahmane Namaha. Om Gam Ganapataye Namaha. Now I am going to discuss on the topic highest form of forgiveness after the prayer. Vyasaya Vishnurupaya Vyasarupaya Vishnave Namo Vai Brahmanidaye Vasishtaya Namo Namaha. Forgiveness is one of the weapon to a good man, a wise person. It has different views. Among them, one is cognitive forgiveness. Another cognitive definition of forgiveness is based on the perspective that sees transgressions as violations of cognitive structures like beliefs. For example, a cognitive approach to forgiveness employs standard cognitive therapy and psychodynamic therapy and interventions to help people change their cognitions. One such example is the cognitive model of Thompson, Snyder, Hoffman, and Rasmussen, etc. Emotional forgiveness is another one. Worthington defined true forgiveness as something that happens only when emotional forgiveness can occur because emotional replacement is necessary. When emotional forgiveness is complete, the person will have replaced negative emotions associated with unforgiveness like anger, resentment, and vengefulness with positive emotions like empathy, compassion, sympathy, altruistic love. They argue that the change in emotional forgiveness as it begins and moves toward completion will be reflected most accurately by changes in emotions, not by changes in thoughts, motivations, behavior, although those will often occur as well. So, what is the sources? There is another source. Forgiveness as a process. How? Finally, all three aspects of forgiveness need to change, namely cognitive, affective, and behavioral. If a person is to fully forgive, they argue that a person must have a form of emotional readiness to forgive before they are likely to be receptive to forgiving. The process of forgiveness may take many forms and involves some of the following: cultivating acceptance and empathy, perspective taking, and benefit finding. For example, a person may decide to rewrite the story of the transgression in a journal by using one or more of these approaches and thereby elevate the anger and allow for emotional healing to occur. Then, what forgiveness is not? Forgiveness is not pardoning, condoning, excusing an offense, or forgetting about it. It is also not the same reconciliation, although that can occur as a part of the forgiveness process. Some also argue that decisional forgiveness and its many forms can sometimes be mistaken for forgiveness. Administration of justice, for example, can resolve conflict and set the score by taking the revenge out of the hands of an individual and by placing it in the hands of society. True forgiveness is, however, is an individual and internal process, and administration of justice is only an external solution to an internal event that rarely satisfies the complexities involved in the process. Finally, condoning which justifies the offense and excusing which implies shifting the blame are no more than forms of a self deception that encourage a deeper sense of victimhood. Next, the psychology of forgiveness. Let us see. Forgiveness is a complex psychological construct, and researchers who study forgiveness stress different aspects of it when they formulate their theories. While forgiveness can be understood how as a situational response and as a skill that can be learned, it is also influenced to a large extent by an aspect of one's personality and as such termed as a trait forgiveness. Some of us are simply more forgiving than others, and psychology attributes this to personality differences and other dispositional qualities that tend to be stable over time. Now, state and trait forgiveness. Let us see. Big five personality traits. What are they? Neuroticism, conscientiousness, extroversion, openness, and agreeableness have been found in some studies to be linked to forgiveness. Agreeableness and neuroticism were most strongly related to forgiveness, and all of them except openness have been found to relate to an unforgiving or forgiving disposition. In addition to the big five, a number of other dispositional qualities affect forgiveness and include relatively stable beliefs, values, and attitudes. Worthington suggests that if we want to become more forgiving, then we must seek to change our dispositional qualities. To provide a target for intervention, he suggests that we start with the qualities related to the self and work on the stability of our self-esteem at first, followed by modification of attitudes of pride and enhancing humility. One can also seek modification of the angry, hostile, aggressive, and vengeful affective dispositions as well as relational qualities, especially those that influence the emotional tone of a relationship. People are said to have an unforgiving disposition when they are unable to forgive across different situations and over time. Although this predisposition could be due to nature as much as nurture, an unforgiving disposition can be distinguished into two types: a grudge holder or a vengeful person. Let us see the grudge holding disposition. People with a grudge holding disposition with harm and misfortune on the offender and express a form of passive resistance and bitterness rather than active retaliation and direct confrontation. Grudge holders ruminate about being a victim and as a result experience a lot of negative emotions, namely bitterness, resentment, hostility, hatred, anger, and fear. Fear of being hurt, offended, and victimized dominates, followed by anger associated with pain and suffering, rather than with active destruction. Finally, when topped with a subcurrent of sadness, the grudge holding disposition can lead to depression over the inability to retaliate or escape the grudge. Now, what is the different? What is the uh, value of vengeful disposition? Characteristics of vengeful disposition. People are not usually born vengeful, but those that are predisposed to hostility and anger tend to be channel an unforgiving disposition toward vengeful motives. These individuals are often hyper attuned to justice or may suffer from narcissistic wound to their pride. Now, forgiving disposition. Forgiving disposition can also come about by nature and by nurture. Worthington argues that a biological disposition toward forgiveness might be apparent soon after birth, particularly if forgiveness is conceptualized as a replacement of the negative emotion of unforgiveness by any of the positive and other oriented emotions. Now, adult attachment model of self. Another mitigating factor that can influence one's ability to forgive is one's attachment style, as defined by Bowl by in his adult attachment model of self. Based on how we develop a sense of attachment to our primary caregivers as infants, these dispositions reflect important cognitive frameworks that are likely to derive interpersonal behavior in adulthood. Studies found that insecure individuals do not accommodate when a close partner hurts them and are often less forgiving than security attached individuals. rumination has been suggested as a connector between effect and ways people respond to hurts. Insecurely attached respond intensely to threatening events and ruminate about the relationship, which in turn chronically primes insecure working model to a point that any threat can and will activate it. Now, sensitivity. Reactivity to sensory stimuli is related to both introversion and emotionality, according to Aaron and Worthington and Wade. They proposed that sensitivity is as a predictor of forgiveness, where sensitivity to rejection as stimuli could be an example of personality characteristic related to unforgiveness. Although forgiveness has been an important concept in many religions and spiritual practices for millennia, it is fairly new as an object of psychological research. Nevertheless, there are already several different models of forgiveness. The interpersonal models usually do not cover the experience of forgiveness as something that occurs within the person and can be termed better as interactions surrounding the transgression. These rituals are based on the evolutionary theory and have been effectively used to foster a repair in the relationships. Sapolsky and others showed that many of the reconciliation rituals throughout history were designed to lower arousal and suggested that this could lead to forgiveness. The reconciliation based model to include the intrapersonal realm and conceptualized forgiveness as an attachment empathy system competing with ruminating justice revenge system, but still for the purpose of governing the social process. Interpersonal theory saw forgiveness as driven by exoneration and entitlement and divided it into stages, although not necessarily sequential. Insight and understanding stages were about recognition of dynamics and identifying the reasons for transgression. When occurring together, they were considered as an exoneration of the individual because, in the context of family, for example, the system was responsible for the problem and no one was guilty. The third and fourth stage, more explicitly interpersonal, were a form of allowing for compensation. Here, the responses of the offender would be considered and explicit forgiving would take place, including expression of forgiveness from victim to the offender, as well as the offender's response to that forgiveness. Interdependence theory model conceptualized forgiveness, particularly in a relationship, as a gut response to transgression characterized by angry emotions and vengeance motive. While most people restrain the gut feeling, subsequent cognitions, emotional, and motivations move them toward pro or anti relationship behavior. These behaviors were categorized into passive loyalty or passive negative neglect on one side, and then active positive voice and active negative exit on the other. Interpersonal forgiveness models are exemplified by Worthington's stress coping model of forgiveness. His early model was based on the classical conditioning model, where his explanation of forgiveness was simply about how to transgression causes emotional pain. Here, forgiveness was defined as triggering of an emotional response where extension of such response would be forgiving until it was triggered again. Now, the process of forgiveness. Forgiveness is a process, first and foremost. There is a intrapersonal process as in letting go of anger, and interpersonal forgiveness which involves the transgressor or and is not always necessary. Recognizing that the interpersonal forgiveness can be conditional and not always possible is key. Conditional forgiveness, because true forgiveness is a service to oneself. It is about our own internal process. The distinction between decisional forgiveness, which is about the external process, and emotional forgiveness, which is about the internal letting go, is very important. Forgiveness also does not work well when a person feels it was not their choice to forgive. And forgiveness as a choice is discussed below. Forgiveness as a process of change. Writing about the benefits of interpersonal transgressions can be an effective form of intervention as it allows for cognitive processing that facilitates forgiveness. When our participants wrote about the benefits or potential benefits of transgression they had recently suffered, they experienced reductions in avoidance versus benevolence motivation and reductions in revenge motivation. The motivations underlying forgiveness. There are different approaches to the process of forgiveness, and taking perspective has been found to be one of the most effective ways to practice forgiveness, as it allows us to connect to the transgressor as a human being. Several studies in effective communications and couples therapy supports these claims. Non-violent communications approach explains how defining the other side's needs can be helpful in learning how to take another's perspective. The ability to forgive oneself or the forces of the universe is also an important part of cultivating forgiveness. The level of acceptance a person is capable of plays a critical role in how effective the process of forgiveness will be, especially since some studies show that some instances of forgiveness may involve grieving. A meta analysis by Wad identified three elements that were common among all effective forgiveness inventions, irrespective of what intervention model or what theory the methods were based on. 1. Use of multiple methods to reduce unforgiveness. Number 2. Committing to forgiveness. 3. And the empathizing or experiencing positive other oriented emotions as an antidote to unforgiveness. One model of forgiveness therapy that places empathy at its center and stresses emotional forgiveness is Worthington's Reach forgiveness model based on the stress and coping theory of forgiveness. Each step in Reach, REACH, is applied to a target transgression that the client is trying to change. Let us see what is Reach. First, R. R means recall the hurt. E. Empathize with the person who hurt you. A means give an altruistic gift of the forgiveness. C means commit to the emotional forgiveness that was experienced. H. Hold on to forgiveness when doubts arise. Then the Reach model is applied to several other key transgressions in a client's life. The client is helped to grant decisional forgiveness and to experience emotional forgiveness for each transgression and for each person. Finally, becoming a more forgiving person is focused on. In one study, forgiveness based group treatments, including the Reach model, were employed to address interpersonal hurts and have shown to be beneficial. The study examined a sample of 162 adults in a community randomly assigned to 3 treatment conditions, 8 weeks in duration: a Reach forgiveness intervention, a process group, and a waitlist control. The forgiveness based treatment was more effective than the waitlist control across a range of forgiveness related constructs, but no more effective than the process condition. It turned out attachment, avoidance, and anxiety interacted with treatment type to predict certain outcomes, indicating that the reach forgiveness model may be more helpful for promoting forgiveness with insecurely attached individuals. श्रेयकांताय कल्याण निधे निधेन्द्राम श्री वेंकटनिवासाय श्रीनिवासाय मंगलम मंगलाशासनभय मदाचार्य पुरोगमय सर्वैश्च पूर्वैराचार्य सत्कृतायास्तु मंगलम्.